Hi graders. This week our mentor sentence really talks about complex sentences. And so we need to understand what that means and what makes a complex sentence. So when we talk about our sentences, we know that we have two different types of clauses. And we learned about that last time, that we have an independent clause and we have a dependent clause. When I think about something that's independent, I know that they like to do something on their own. And so an independent clause is one that can stand all by itself. It's a complete thought and a complete sentence. A dependent clause needs some help. And so I like to think of a dependent clause as maybe the kiddo in this situation that needs help from its parent, the independent clause. And so a complex sentence has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause, and that's what makes it a complex sentence. It has two of those things. And so our mentor sentence this week is, even though he had won, Rock was still unsatisfied. And so as I look at this sentence, I can break it into two parts. I can break it into an independent clause and a dependent clause. Now I'm thinking to myself, okay, the independent clause means it makes sense all by itself. And so if I broke this up right here in the middle at the comma and it says, even though he had won. Well, when I read that out loud, I think, what? Even though he had won, what happens next? I don't have a complete thought. That must be my dependent clause. So I would highlight that yellow. And when I read the second clause or part of our sentence, it says, Rock was still unsatisfied. Well, that's a complete thought. That can stand on its own as a whole sentence. This is my independent clause. So I would highlight that blue. Now here's another way that we can identify complex sentences. We know it has an independent clause and we know it has a dependent clause. It also has this fancy word called a subordinating conjunction. Friends, all this means is that there is a word in that dependent clause that hooks our thoughts together. And so you can see some examples here on this chart. We have like though, or whenever, who, since, because. All of those conjunctions, words that join some thoughts together, give us the hint that we're dealing with a complex sentence. And so as I look through this sentence, even though he had won, Rock was still unsatisfied. That subordinating conjunction would be right here, even though, because that's what pulls my thoughts together. It ties he had won to Rock was still unsatisfied. As a quick little review, we're going to watch this video that will give you just a couple more examples of a complex sentence, and then you'll hop on over and complete this assignment, which we already did together, as long as you were watching.
Hello, grammarians. Hello, Rosie. So in this video, we're going to talk about complex sentences. We talked in another video about simple and compound sentences. So that is like one independent clause or two independent clauses. And with a complex sentence, we're going to introduce something called dependent clause. So a sentence needs at least one independent clause to function as a sentence. But with complex, we're going to add this dependent clause. So Rosie, what's an example of a complex sentence?
When we buy a birthday cake, we have to make sure it's London.
So this sentence, when we buy his birthday cake, we have to make sure it's lemon, is made up of two clauses, and I've written them in different colors here. So the second one, the pink one, can stand on its own as a sentence. You can just say, we have to make sure it's lemon.
It functions as an independent clause of the sentence. It gives the information that is missing from the sentence. We don't necessarily know what is, but we do have all the components of an independent clause here. We've got a subject and a verb, have to, and we have multiple verbs.
Yeah, I want to make sure.
So the sentence is relying on some information that's not provided, but it does still stand up in some sense.
Right, if we could have a sentence before it, it's like, we're going to go buy a birthday cake. We have to make sure it's lemon, right? Those can be two separate sentences. In this case, we have this other clause, this a dependent clause. We can't just say, when we buy his birthday cake as a sentence. That doesn't really stand on its own. It doesn't convey the information that a sentence needs to convey. So we could have an independent clause or a sentence that's just, we buy his birthday cake. It's kind of a weird construction. I don't know that I would say that. You could maybe say, we are buying his birthday cake, right? But we buy his birthday cake still works as a sentence. It has a subject, we, and a verb, buy, and it expresses a complete idea. It's an action that's happening, and it tells you who's doing it. But we add this thing called a subordinating conjunction, that's this when here, and that makes this into a dependent clause. It can't be a sentence by itself, so it depends on the later clause. We have to make sure it's lemon to be part of a sentence. Okay.
So friends, you were able to see the complex sentence has those two parts. Remember, an independent clause that can stand on its own and a dependent clause that needs a little bit of help. And that dependent clause has one of those fancy subordinating conjunctions that make it dependent. So hop on over to Seesaw, highlight our dependent clause yellow, highlight your independent clause blue, and circle that subordinating conjunction. Later in the week, we'll check out a few other sentences for examples.